Do you think time heals all wounds, or some never close?
I was washing a coffee mug when my phone buzzed, and I glanced at the family thread just in time to see my sister's message land on top of the photos of Lay's and palm trees and airport drinks. A neat little sentence that read like a verdict and made my stomach go weird in that old familiar way, because she wrote that this Christmas was going to be a Hawaii trip for people who valued peace and togetherness, and that she did not want drama this year. So it would be simpler if I sat this one out. And there it was, the kind of soft cruelty that gets packaged as kindness, because it is easier to swallow when someone pretends they are protecting the group rather than just pushing you out of it. I stood there with the mug in my hand and felt the usual cycle try to spool up, that messy tug between explaining myself, defending myself, and offering to be smaller so everyone else could be comfortable, and then something inside me just stopped. Almost like a switch finally clicked after years of rattling, and the room went quiet in my head in a way that felt brand new, because I was not confused anymore, I was not bargaining with myself anymore, and I was definitely not begging for a spot on a trip that I was expected to be grateful for while also pretending I did not notice the rules were always different for me. My sister Emily and her husband Mark were living in my house, not as tenants with a real lease and agreed responsibilities, but as long-term guests who had promised to help for a few months while they got back on their feet. A few months that stretched into more than a year while I covered the mortgage and the insurance and the utilities and the annoying surprise repairs no one sees on Instagram. And they contributed in ways that looked generous on holidays, but somehow evaporated by the time the credit card bills rolled around, and every time I tried to draw a line, Emily would sigh and tell me I was making things tense, and Mark would laugh and say I was too serious, and my parents would ask me to be patient because Emily was working through a stressful season. I used to swallow it because I believed there was some prize at the end for being the stable one, the helper, the person who made other people's storms pass faster. Yet as I stared at that sentence about not wanting drama, I realized there was no prize. Only a pattern where I did the heavy lifting while Emily curated the story and our parents nodded along because peace at any cost had become more sacred to them than fairness, and suddenly I felt steady enough to do something I should have done a long time ago, which was to stop acting like a guest in my own life and start acting like the owner of my house and my time and my boundaries. I did not answer the message, because answering would pull me back into the script where I try to prove I am reasonable while Emily performs being gracious. So instead I opened my laptop and pulled up the folder where I keep my documents. The deed with my name on it, the draft month-to-month agreement I had emailed months ago that Emily never signed, the text threads where she called their stay temporary and promised to contribute when Mark's contract came through, and as I scrolled through it, all I could see the outline of something clean and simple and absolutely fair, a plan that did not require a fight or a speech, just a few clear actions completed in the right order. I called my bank and removed the extra card I had added for groceries during the transition, a decision I made when I still believed the transition had an end date. And I sat there while the rep confirmed that the card was deauthorized and the digital wallet access was revoked, and I felt a little tremor of relief that did not feel cruel at all. It felt like turning off a faucet that had been running for far too long. And after that I emailed the cell provider and took Mark off my family plan, because that had been presented as a 2-month bridge but had somehow become permanent, and then I logged into the SmartLock app and disabled their guest code, not to trap them, but to reset the system so that I alone controlled permanent access while I arranged what needed to happen next. I could hear the old version of me whispering that this was too much and that I should wait until after the holidays, yet the older and quieter voice, the one that had finally found the switch, pointed out that respect does not begin after a vacation. It begins the minute you decide you are done pretending that disrespect is a misunderstanding, and with that clarity I wrote a short, factual note that explained that their guest arrangement was ending and that formal notice would follow in the morning, and I printed it and left it in an envelope on the kitchen island because I wanted the message to be simple and hard to spin. And then I took the spare car key they had been using and locked the car in the garage because the insurance was in my name and I was done paying for their errands. When my mother called a little later, her voice already set to the soothing tone she uses when she is about to ask me to be bigger than the situation, I let it go to voicemail. because I knew exactly how the conversation would go and I had no interest in reciting my lines. And when Emily texted me a string of cheerful updates about their layover and the ocean view and how restful it felt to be away from conflict, I stared at the bubbles and thought that she might never understand that she was the one who brought the conflict into my house, that I had been the one absorbing it so no one had to look at it closely, and that the absorption was over now. I sent one message, a single line that did not invite debate and did not promise an argument, and it said that I hoped she enjoyed her peaceful trip and that she should check the kitchen island when she got home, because there was something waiting there that would keep the peace far longer than a vacation ever could. And then I put my phone face down on the counter and finally finished my coffee, already knowing that the first move had been made and that the next one would land tomorrow with paperwork and signatures and a timeline that did not bend for anyone. And for the first time in years, I felt like I could breathe without asking permission. By the time their connecting flight took off and the family thread filled with photos that were supposed to look like unity but mostly looked like a performance, I had already pulled the envelope from the kitchen island back into my hands and rewritten it into something sharper and cleaner, because if I was going to stop being the person who cushioned everyone else's chaos, I needed every word to carry weight, and I needed every step to be boring and professional so there would be nothing for anyone to chew on except the facts. I started with the simplest truth, which was that Emily and Mark were not tenants under any signed agreement, and that what began as a short stay had mutated into an arrangement that only worked because I kept absorbing the costs and the awkwardness. So I called a lawyer friend who knows landlord rules the way some people know football stats, and I asked for a quick reality check, and she walked me through the basics in a calm voice that felt like a handrail, explaining that when a guest refuses to transition into a proper lease, you end the guest arrangement in writing, you give a clear timeline that complies with the state's notice requirement for a month-to-month occupancy, you deliver it in a way that is easy to verify, and you do not get dragged into side arguments about tone or timing because the paper is the conversation and everything else is a detour. I typed the notice with the kind of care I usually reserve for presentations, adding dates written out in words and a specific move-out day that gave them more time than the statute required because I wanted it to be beyond reasonable. And then I printed 3 copies, one to hand over, one to mail certified to my own address for a proof of service trail, and one to keep in a folder that I would not show anyone unless they tried to rewrite what happened. And as the pages came out of the printer, I felt that quiet steadiness settle in again, the one that told me I was not being cruel, I was being clear. From there I handled the logistics that always float just under the surface and give people excuses to linger, so I scheduled a locksmith for early morning on the day after the notice drop. Not to bar them from the house while they were still legally allowed to be there, but to replace the beat-up deadbolt and remove the feeling that they could wander in at midnight with friends and a borrowed code, because boundaries that live in software feel less real to people who love gray zones. And I also emailed the storage place down the road to confirm availability for a medium unit and a same-day lock purchase, because I knew exactly how the story would go once Emily realized the free ride was ending, and I wanted the practical solution ready to go so there would be no reason to leave boxes in my hallway and call it a transition. I opened my banking dashboard and did a boring but necessary audit, closing out the little automatic transfers that had been set up as temporary help for their phone and their streaming bundle and the random subscription Mark swore he needed for his side hustle. And I put a note on my calendar to run a second pass in a week in case I had missed anything, and while I was in there I printed statements that showed the utilities in my name for the whole past year, not because I planned to hand them around, but because I was tired of being gaslit by memories that shift with the weather, and if someone wanted to claim I had been fine with this arrangement, I preferred to hold paper that said otherwise. When my parents called again, their calls stacked one on top of another like pressure pretending to be concern, I let both go to voicemail because I already knew the script they were working with. And I took a slow breath and texted my mother a single line that said I was busy with house matters and would call her in a few days, and I did not add a smiley or a softening phrase, because I have finally learned that polite words are often taken as invitations by people who have no intention of Respecting your boundary unless it looks like a wall, and after I hit send I put the phone in a drawer and sat with a yellow pad and wrote out my own checklist in full sentences, each item beginning with a verb because movement, once you start it, is its own kind of relief. I also thought about safety in the plainest way, not the dramatic kind with locks and sirens, but the everyday kind where you plan for the moment a conversation tilts sideways. So I asked my neighbor Leah if she could be home during the time window when I planned to deliver the notice, and she said yes without a lecture or a curious tilt of the head. And that small act of uncomplicated support felt like air in a room that had been stuffy for a long time, and we agreed that if she heard voices rising, she would simply step outside to water her plants, which is not heroic, it is just another pair of eyes, and sometimes that makes all the difference. Before bed, I walked through the house with a trash bag and pulled together the little piles that had sprouted in every room, the travel brochures Emily never threw away, the snack wrappers Mark left next to the couch, the stack of mail they ignored unless it had the word package on it, and I was not furious as I cleaned. I was inventorying my life the way you do when you finally decide to be a grown woman about your own space. And when I finished, I laid the 3 copies of the notice on the dining table with a pen, a highlighter, and a small roll of painter's tape for posting a duplicate on the interior door, because I wanted to leave a tidy trail that even a hostile storyteller could not smudge. I went to sleep with the alarm set for early morning and the locksmith appointment confirmed and the certified mail label already printed and the folder by the door, and I do not mind telling you that for the first time in a very long time, I was not rehearsing a speech in my head or bracing for the blowback. I was simply ready to do the next right step in the correct order, and as I closed my eyes I knew that when Emily posted her cheerful photos from the beach tomorrow, the only caption I would care about was the one I was about to write in legally plain English and taped to my own door. I left the house early with the folder under my arm and the certified mail slip already filled out, because I knew that if I moved through the morning without hesitating, the day would shape itself around action rather than arguments. So I taped the notice to the inside of the kitchen door at eye level with painter's tape that would not damage the paint. I slid an identical copy into the envelope I had addressed to myself for proof of service, and I took a quick photo of the posted page for my records, not to gloat or to provoke, but to leave a straightforward trail that could not be spun into something theatrical later when the calls started and the stories grew more colorful with every retelling. By the time I reached the post office, the family thread had already sprouted sunrise pictures and captions about peace, which felt almost funny if you ignore the sting, because nothing says peace like excluding the person who pays the mortgage. So I stood in line with the envelope and the clerk stamped it without ceremony, and I walked out into a day that had no theme other than follow the plan, which is why I texted Emily a single sentence that did not ask for a reply and did not invite a fight, telling her that a formal notice reflecting the end of their guest arrangement had been served at the house and that it contained a generous move-out window within the month, and that I would be arranging a neutral storage unit nearby if they preferred a clean drop rather than a slow packing parade through the living room. The first call came 3 minutes later and rolled to voicemail, because I had no interest in letting my voice carry the weight of a decision that should have been made a year ago. And then another call from my mother stacked on top of it with the tone I could hear even through the screen, that careful blend of concern and control that always sounds like an invitation to be the bigger person at my own expense. So I sent her one line explaining that I had handled a house matter in writing and that we would talk soon, and I put the phone face down as the messages bloomed, because if you do not create silence on purpose, people who benefit from your noise will keep you talking until you forget what you came to say. When I finally answered Emily, she skipped hello and launched into a speech about cruelty and timing and family loyalty, explaining that Christmas is sacred and that I was ruining the trip for everyone. And I told her calmly that Christmas is not a coupon that extends free lodging into forever, that a guest arrangement is not a lease, that the notice respected state timelines and even added grace on top, and that I was available to coordinate movers on 2 separate days to make everything efficient, which only made her angrier because clarity is an unforgiving mirror for people who prefer fog, and she started listing every grocery run she had ever done as if a bag of spinach cancels a mortgage. And I let the words pass through me because the paper on my table speaks better than I ever could. Then Mark called with the kind of bravado that wilts under paperwork, telling me I had no right to treat family like tenants, and I told him as evenly as I could that I was not treating them like tenants. I was treating them like adults who had stayed as guests long past reasonable and who were now receiving a written end to that arrangement, and he tried a different angle about how the house felt like theirs because they had painted a room and fixed a loose cabinet handle. And I told him the house feels like theirs because I allowed it to, which is ending now, and the shift must have rattled him, because bravado slid into irritation, and irritation tipped into honesty, and he said a sentence he should never have said. A sentence that clicked into place like a key in a lock, because he bragged that they had not signed anything on purpose, and had kept money aside for trips and upgrades since rent never left their account, and that they always knew I would not push, because I hate conflict, and he said it while he was still in the family thread bubble, so the transcript landed inside a notification preview I had already trained myself to screenshot. I did not congratulate him for handing me exactly what my lawyer friend had told me to hold if things got messy. I did not tell him that words about no lease, no rent, and deliberate avoidance of responsibility tend to look very plain when they are collected under a subject line called occupancy records. And I did not mention that he had just confirmed in writing that there was no tenant relationship to complicate the process, because I preferred to let him keep talking while I saved everything in a folder titled with today's date and the phrase guest termination, and I kept my voice calm while I told him that movers would be scheduled and that I would send the storage reservation number by the end of the week. And he huffed something about telling the whole family what kind of person I am before he hung up and dove into the thread with a message designed to make me look like a villain. The thread erupted the way it always does when Emily decides to be fragile in public and fierce in private, but I did not rise to it this time, because I had what I needed and I had the next steps lined up. And I had a voicemail from Mark's first missed call that I finally played only once I was sitting at my dining table with a pen, a notepad, and a glass of water, and listening to his words land without the filter of my patience. I realized he had not only given me admissions, he had named a group chat they kept with two of their friends where they joked about living on sponsorship, which meant screenshots existed somewhere outside my family and could be found without a fight, and it was in that moment, with his own voice as my witness, that something inside me settled into a kind of certainty I had been chasing for years, because now I knew exactly where to press next, and I also knew that when I did, the story Emily was busy selling to anyone with an inbox would finally start collapsing under the weight of its own details. I spent the afternoon doing something I used to avoid because it felt confrontational even though it was only administrative, which was to collect the quiet facts and line them up so neatly that they did the talking without me. So I opened my laptop and built a simple timeline that began with the month they moved in and stepped through the promises that followed, each one anchored by a text or an email, or a bank statement showing that the mortgage, the insurance, the water, the power, and the internet lived on my shoulders while their contribution was a rotating carousel of good intentions. And when the timeline felt steady, I attached the screenshot of Mark bragging about keeping rent money for trips because no lease existed and about counting on my dislike of conflict to keep the gravy flowing. And I saved it all as a single tidy file with a date in the title and a line that said guest arrangement closure because I wanted the file to feel like punctuation rather than drama. I did not blast it across the family thread because I have finally learned that public shouting only feeds the story Emily is always trying to sell, so I sent it privately to the two relatives who matter most when it comes to calming down the rumor mill, which are my Aunt Linda, who has a radar for nonsense that could guide pilots through fog, and my cousin Tara, who is not impressed by vacations purchased with other people's patience, and in my note I did not ask for advice or approval. I simply said that an arrangement in my home had ended in writing, that the timeline and screenshots were provided for clarity because a different version of events was already making the rounds, and that I would be grateful if they did not engage in debates because the paper was the paper and the move-out dates were the move-out dates. Within an hour my aunt called and said she had known something was off from the first time Emily described their stay as a sabbatical, which is not what you call it when your sister is paying your bills. And she told me she was proud of me for handling it cleanly, and that she would be blocking the inevitable guilt monologues that were already lining up in her inbox. And then she asked if I wanted her husband to be present on move-out day in case Mark tried to escalate, and the offer felt like real family rather than the performance kind, so I said yes and wrote his name on the same page where I had already written Leah's, because the combination of calm witnesses and boring paperwork turns heat into steam that cannot hold shape. While those calls played out, the thread did what the thread always does when Emily realizes the audience might be slipping, which is to tilt into a coordinated chorus about kindness and forgiveness and the importance of family. And my mother finally got through to me with the careful voice she uses when she is walking a tightrope between me and Emily, asking if there was any way to pause this until after the trip because it would be a shame to ruin everyone's holiday. And I told her as gently as I could that holidays do not suspend gravity and that I was not ruining anything. I was ending a guest arrangement in compliance with the law after giving more grace than the law requires. And I reminded her that I had offered 2 separate mover windows and a storage unit nearby so that the process could be as painless as possible, and she sighed and said she understood while also telling me that Emily was in tears and could not stop shaking, which once would have hooked me into caretaking, but which now sounded like a familiar soundtrack that did not match the film. The exposure part happened almost by itself once the private notes landed, because my cousin, who is surgically allergic to hypocrisy, replied to the thread with a gentle nudge that said she had seen a different set of facts and that maybe we should all step back and let the people directly involved manage their own paperwork, and then she stopped posting, which is the social media equivalent of turning off the oxygen on a bonfire, and I did nothing else because I did not need to do anything else. Not when I had also sent the voicemail transcript to my lawyer friend along with the screenshot of Mark's message about living on sponsorship, and she replied with a sentence that felt like a vertebra clicking into place. Because she said that the combination of no signed lease, written admissions, and a generous written notice made my position unshakably clean, and that any public smear only helped me if this ever had to escalate. 2 practical things closed the loop in a way that felt like justice without theatrics, and the first was a call to the moving company with whom I booked 2 half-day blocks under their names, prepaid by me for 1 day only so that no one could claim I had trapped their belongings, with clear instructions that any overflow after the allotted time would be billed directly to Emily and Mark at the door. And the second was an email to the smart lock manufacturer confirming the new master access hierarchy and a log retention request for the past 6 months, because while I hoped no one would try to replay history, I had decided to be done letting my memory carry the burden that timestamps can carry better. Late in the evening, while the beach photos kept multiplying and my phone finally found some quiet, an unknown number left a voicemail from a resort asking to confirm the card on file for incidentals because the one on record was not active. And I sat very still while the words rolled out because I knew exactly which card that was and exactly why it was not active, and although I did not cheer or gloat, I recognized the shape of a consequence catching up to a choice, and I let the message sit. Because rescuing them would have taught the same old lesson about how loudly one must shout to win my attention, and I am done teaching that class. Just before midnight, another notification arrived that was not from the family, a message from one of Mark's friends who had been in the so-called sponsorship chat and who apparently had grown tired of being part of the joke. And he sent me a handful of screenshots where Emily and Mark laid out a little plan to hold a party in my living room the weekend after they got back because they wanted one last blowout before they moved into their next temporary setup. And as I looked at the date they had chosen and the guest list that included people who had already broken a lamp in my house once, I felt a calm I did not expect, because it meant I was not overreacting, and it meant the locks would be changed exactly on time. And it also meant that tomorrow morning, when I sent the final logistics email with mover slots and storage information, I would be including one additional sentence that would remove even the possibility of a celebration in my living room. And while I wrote that line in my head, I realized that the true hook for the end of the story had finally arrived, because the party they had planned as a victory lap was about to become proof that the lap was over. The morning after I saw those screenshots of the so-called party plans, I woke earlier than usual and moved through the kitchen with the kind of quiet energy that comes from knowing the last piece of a long and messy puzzle is finally about to click into place. Because I was not scrambling or second-guessing anymore, I was simply executing the final step of a plan that had been forming in my head for months, and by now it felt almost routine, like clearing a drawer or finishing a long overdue chore. Only this time the chore happened to involve removing two grown adults who had built their comfort on my silence. I sat down with my laptop and drafted the final logistics message, the one I had been waiting to send because it marked the true point of no return, and I laid it out in long sentences that could not be trimmed or twisted, explaining that the movers were scheduled on 2 separate days, that the prepaid storage unit was reserved and ready with the code provided, that any belongings left after the move-out date would be considered abandoned, and that access to the house would be fully reset at the end of that day. And then I added one more line, the line that mattered most to me because it was both practical and final, telling them that gatherings of any kind in my home were prohibited effective immediately, and that any attempt to host guests would be treated as trespass and documented accordingly, which meant their little idea of a last victory lap had evaporated before it even reached the starting line. I sent the email to both of them, copied myself for the paper trail, and then immediately forwarded it to my lawyer friend with the subject line "Final Communication for Record," and she responded with a single sentence that read, "Looks perfect. You're covered," and I let that sentence settle into me like the last bolt tightening on a structure that had once felt like it was shaking itself apart. The locksmith arrived exactly on schedule, and I stayed in the kitchen while he worked, listening to the quiet scrape and click of old locks being replaced with new hardware, and the sound was not dramatic, it was not cinematic. It was simply a practical soundtrack to a boundary finally being made physical, because people like Emily and Mark never take words seriously until a door actually refuses them entry, and when the locksmith left and handed me the new set of keys, I felt no triumph or gloating. I just felt done. The kind of done that is not about slamming doors, but about closing them and walking into a quieter room. Predictably, the messages began to stack again when Emily saw the logistics email, and she called me names I had never heard her use before, accusing me of cruelty and betrayal and claiming that she would never recover from the humiliation. And then she pivoted into her familiar script about family ties and forgiveness, asking me to undo this, because Christmas should be about togetherness. But the problem with a script is that once you have heard it too many times it loses its power, and so I did not argue or explain or remind her of the year of bills and promises. I simply replied that all information was already provided in writing, that I would not be taking further calls on the matter, and that the schedule was firm. And then I placed my phone back on the counter without watching the screen light up again, because silence, once you get used to it, is not frightening, it is freedom. The family thread reacted exactly as expected, with a few relatives still choosing the peace at any cost line, urging me to show grace, because the holidays are no time for conflict. But I did not need to defend myself because the timeline file was already doing the quiet work of making sure the truth leaked into the right corners, and I noticed that the louder Emily grew on the thread, the fewer reactions her posts received, as if people were finally learning to recognize the shape of her drama, and were quietly stepping back from it. And in that moment I understood that sometimes justice does not come from winning an argument, it comes from refusing to keep supplying oxygen to a fire that burns only if you stand there fanning it. Move-out day itself was uneventful, which is the best possible word when you are dealing with people who thrive on spectacle, because the movers worked quickly, the storage unit accepted the boxes, and my uncle stood calmly on the porch while Mark muttered under his breath and Emily sniffled into her phone, and I stayed inside with a book I barely read because I did not need to insert myself into the performance outside. I only needed to hold the line until the last box was gone, and when it was, I locked the door, thanked my uncle, and sat down on the couch in a house that felt lighter than it had in over a year. In the days that followed, Emily launched her campaign of tears to anyone who would listen, calling relatives, posting vague updates about betrayal, hinting at cruelty, and trying to collect sympathy points like seashells. But what struck me most was that the response was muted because people had already seen enough to know there was another version of the story. And when my aunt finally told me that most of the family had quietly stopped engaging with Emily's calls, I felt a wave of confirmation that was not about revenge but about clarity, because for once I was not the one being asked to explain myself or to shrink my experience for the sake of peace. Now she is crying to anyone who will pick up, telling them how heartless I am and how she cannot believe I did this to my own sister. But the calls do not land the way they used to, and the guilt does not land the way it used to, because the locks are changed. The bills are mine again. The silence is mine again, and the weight is gone, and I do not need anyone to cheer for me or take my side, because the truth is not up for debate anymore. It is sitting in my folders and living in the absence of their things in my hallway, and that is enough. I know she will never admit what really happened, because admitting it would mean confronting the comfort she built on my back, and I know she will keep telling people that I am cold and unkind, but for once in my life I do not feel the need to argue or correct. Because the proof is in the space, I can finally breathe in, and the final word is not mine or hers, it is the silence that followed once the locks clicked shut.